Have you ever stopped in the middle of your day, not because you were tired, but because something felt off, like a quiet suspicion that the life you were living was not entirely your own choice, that the path you were walking was handed to you long before you had the awareness to question it? And if that thought has ever crossed your mind, even for a second, then you are already closer to the truth than most people will ever be. Because the greatest deception is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles slowly into your thinking until it feels like your own voice. You were taught to work hard, to follow instructions, to respect authority, to be responsible, and none of these things are wrong on the surface. They sound noble, even necessary. But what if the intention behind them was never to elevate you? What if it was to position you to guide you into a role that serves a system you never consciously agreed to? And what if the reward you were promised was never designed to match the effort you were told to give? From a young age, you were conditioned to believe that life follows a formula. Study well, get a stable job, save money, avoid risks, retire safely, and everything will work out. And for a while, this narrative feels comforting. It gives you direction. It gives you a sense of control. But as time passes, something begins to crack beneath the surface. You start to notice that the people who followed this path the most faithfully are not the ones living with freedom. They are the ones counting down days, protecting what little they have, hoping nothing goes wrong because there is no margin left for error. You see it in their eyes. Not always in words, but in the quiet resignation, in the way they talk about the future as something to endure rather than something to create. And if you look closely enough, you will recognize a pattern that no one openly explains. The system rewards compliance far more consistently than it rewards independent thought. And over time, this shapes not only what you do, but what you believe is possible. You were not only taught how to work, you were taught what to expect from life. And that expectation became a ceiling, an invisible boundary that defines how far you are willing to go. Not because it is the limit of your ability, but because it is the limit of your belief. And once a person accepts a limited expectation, they begin to organize their entire life around it. Their choices become safer. Their risks become smaller. Their vision becomes narrower. And eventually they call this reality. When in truth, it is simply a reflection of what they were trained to accept. The most powerful part of this deception is not that it restricts your actions. It is that it shapes your identity. It convinces you that you are the kind of person who should be careful, who should not aim too high, who should be grateful for stability even if that stability costs you your potential. And once that identity is formed, you begin to defend it. You justify your limitations. You explain away your hesitation. You call it maturity. You call it responsibility. But underneath all those labels, there is a quiet surrender that goes unnoticed. Consider how rarely you were encouraged to define your own purpose. Not your career, not your role, but your purpose. The reason you exist beyond survival, beyond comfort, beyond fitting in. That question was never made central to your development. Instead, you were guided toward practicality, toward predictability, toward paths that have already been walked by millions before you. And while there is safety in that, there is also a cost. Because a life that is fully predictable is rarely a life that is fully lived. There is a reason why so many people reach a certain age and feel an unexplainable emptiness, even if they have done everything right according to the rules they were given. Because deep down there is a part of you that recognizes when you are not expressing your full capacity. And that recognition does not disappear. It waits. It lingers. It grows stronger. In moments of silence. In moments when you are not distracted, when you are forced to face the question that was postponed for years. Is this all there is? And here is where the deception reveals its final layer. You begin to believe that the problem is you. That you did not work hard enough. That you were not disciplined enough. That you were not lucky enough. And this belief keeps the system intact. Because as long as you blame yourself, you will never question the structure that shaped your choices in the first place. You will continue to adjust your effort without ever examining the direction of that effort. And that is how entire lifetimes are spent moving, but never truly advancing. But the truth operates differently. It does not ask you to reject effort. It asks you to examine alignment. It does not ask you to abandon discipline. It asks you to apply it towards something that expands you rather than confines you. And most importantly, it asks you to reconsider the idea that your current path is the only path available. Because once that idea breaks, everything else begins to shift. You start to notice that the people who lived differently did not simply work harder. They thought differently. They expected differently. They refused to accept the default script. And while their actions may look similar on the surface, the internal standard they operate from is entirely different. They are not working toward survival. They are working toward creation. They are not waiting for permission. They are moving from conviction. And that distinction changes the trajectory of everything they touch. The question then is not whether you are capable. It is whether you are willing to question what you have accepted as normal. Because the moment you do, the entire structure that once felt solid begins to reveal its fragility. And what once looked like certainty begins to look like repetition. What once looked like security begins to look like limitation. And in that realization, there is both discomfort and possibility because you can no longer pretend you do not see it. And once you truly see it, something shifts in a way that cannot be undone. You may continue to move through the same environment, interact with the same people, follow the same routines for a time, but internally you are no longer the same. You are no longer fully convinced by the narrative that once guided you. There is a distance now, a quiet awareness that keeps asking questions, that keeps observing, that refuses to settle back into unconscious acceptance. That awareness does not immediately change your circumstances, but it changes your relationship with them. And that is where transformation begins. Not in action at first, but in perception. Because the moment you stop seeing your life as fixed, you open the possibility that it can be redesigned. And once that possibility becomes real to you, even if only slightly, you are no longer operating under the same constraints that once defined you. And in that space between what you were taught and what you are beginning to see, a tension forms, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, and it stays with you, quietly reminding you that the life you were handed is not necessarily the life you are meant to keep. And that realization carries a weight that cannot be ignored for long. You do not wake up one day and decide to live a small life. It happens quietly, almost invisibly through a series of choices that never felt like choices at all. And before you realize it, the version of you that once imagined something greater has been replaced by someone who simply manages what is in front of them. At first, it looks harmless, even reasonable. You choose comfort because you are tired. You delay action because the timing is not perfect. You avoid risk because you have responsibilities. And none of these decisions seem dangerous on their own. But what you do not see is the pattern forming underneath. A pattern that slowly trains your mind to prefer what is easy over what is meaningful, what is familiar over what is possible. Comfort is not the enemy because it feels good. It is the enemy because it removes urgency. It dulls the internal signal that once pushed you to grow. And over time, that signal becomes weaker. Not because you lost your potential, but because you stopped responding to it. You began to negotiate with it. You told yourself tomorrow instead of now, later instead of today. And repetition turned that delay into identity. An identity once formed begins to govern everything. It shapes what you believe you can do, what you believe you deserve, what you believe is realistic for someone like you. And this is where the chain tightens. Not around your body, but around your perception. Because once you accept a limited identity, you stop reaching for anything beyond it. Not out of fear alone, but out of logic. It simply does not make sense to aim higher when you no longer see yourself as someone capable of achieving it. Social conditioning reinforces this at every level. You are surrounded by expectations that feel normal because everyone else follows them. Stability is praised. Predictability is respected. Ambition beyond a certain point is quietly discouraged. Not always directly, but through tone, through subtle reactions, through the way people respond when you speak about something bigger than what they understand. And gradually you learn to adjust your language, to soften your vision, to present yourself in a way that does not challenge the comfort of others. You begin to measure your life against the lives around you. And if everyone is struggling in a similar way, it becomes easier to accept that struggle as standard. You stop asking whether the system itself is flawed. You start asking how you can better fit into it. And this shift is critical because the moment you focus on fitting in, you stop thinking about breaking out. And once that happens, the possibility of a different life begins to fade. What makes this even more dangerous is that the system does not need to control you directly. It only needs to influence your habits. Because habits create outcomes, and outcomes reinforce beliefs, and beliefs lock you into cycles that feel self-generated. You think you chose this life. You think this is simply how things are when in reality your choices were shaped long before you were aware enough to question them. You wake up at a certain time not because you designed your day, but because you were trained to follow a schedule. You pursue certain goals not because they fulfill you, but because they were presented as the logical next step. You spend your energy maintaining a structure that was never built to expand you. And the more you invest in it, the harder it becomes to step away because now it feels like you would be losing something, even if that something was never truly yours. And then something subtle begins to happen. Ambition, the kind that once made you restless, the kind that once made you imagine a different future, starts to fade. Not disappear completely, but weaken. It shows up less often. And when it does, it feels unrealistic, impractical, even irresponsible. You begin to associate your own potential with risk and your current limitations with safety. And that inversion changes everything. You no longer ask what you are capable of. You ask what is reasonable. You no longer think about expansion. You think about protection. And while that may feel like maturity, it is often just adaptation to a system that benefits from your predictability more than your growth. Look closely at how ambition is treated in your environment. When someone dares to think bigger, to act differently, to reject the expected path, the response is rarely encouragement. It is skepticism, sometimes disguised as concern, sometimes as advice. But underneath it is the same message. Stay where you are. Do not disrupt the pattern. Do not force others to question their own choices by making different ones over time. Even your internal dialogue begins to echo these voices. You start to censor your own thoughts. You dismiss your own ideas before they fully form. You lower your expectations to match what feels acceptable. And this is where the chain becomes self-sustaining, because now you are no longer being influenced from the outside. You are enforcing the limitation from within. The most dangerous prison is the one you help maintain because it does not feel like confinement. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being realistic. It feels like understanding how the world works. And as long as you interpret it that way, you will continue to operate within it without resistance. But beneath all of this, something remains unchanged. A part of you that still recognizes the gap between what you are living and what you are capable of. It may be quiet. It may be buried under routine and obligation, but it has not disappeared. It waits for moments when your attention is not occupied, when the noise fades just enough for you to hear it again. And when you do, it does not shout. It does not demand. It simply reminds you, not of what you lack, but of what you have ignored, not of what is impossible, but of what you have not allowed yourself to consider. And in that moment, the comfort that once felt safe begins to feel restrictive. The routine that once felt stable begins to feel repetitive, and the life you have been maintaining begins to feel like something that was never meant to be permanent. That shift does not immediately break the chain, but it changes how you see it. And once you see it clearly, once you recognize that what held you in place was never force but familiarity, you can no longer fully return to the unconscious state that kept you there. Because awareness has a way of staying. Even when you try to ignore it, even when you attempt to justify your current path, even when you tell yourself that this is enough, and at that point something inside you stops settling as easily as before. It does not create instant action, but it creates resistance to staying the same. And that resistance, quiet as it is, begins to reshape the way you respond to everything that once felt automatic. At some point, without warning and without ceremony, a thought enters your mind that does not feel like the others. It is not about tasks, not about responsibilities, not about what needs to be done next. It is a question, quiet but persistent, asking whether the life you are living is truly yours. And once that question appears with enough clarity, it does not leave easily. It lingers beneath everything you do, changing the way you see even the most ordinary moments. You may be in the middle of a routine day doing what you have always done, following the same patterns that once felt automatic, and suddenly there is a pause, not external, but internal, a brief separation between you and the role you are playing, and in that separation you notice something unsettling. You are functioning, but you are not fully present. You are moving, but not in a direction you consciously chose. And that realization carries a weight that cannot be explained by logic alone. It is in moments like this that the idea of a mission begins to surface, not as something grand or dramatic, but as a subtle knowing that you are not designed to simply maintain what already exists. That there is a dimension of your life that has not yet been expressed. And the more you allow yourself to sit with that awareness, the more difficult it becomes to ignore. For a long time, that part of you remained silent because it was never given permission to speak. You were taught to prioritize what is practical, what is expected, what is immediately necessary, and anything beyond that was treated as optional, even indulgent. But now the structure that once made those priorities feel secure begins to feel incomplete, as if it was only ever a partial answer to a much larger question. You start to revisit memories, not in detail, but in feeling. Moments when you imagined something different, when you felt a sense of possibility that did not depend on approval or certainty, and you realized that those moments were not random. They were signals, glimpses of a direction you never fully explored. Not because it was impossible, but because it was unfamiliar. The idea that you might have a mission challenges everything you were taught to believe about life. Because it suggests that your existence is not meant to be passive, not meant to be reactive, but intentional, directed. And that level of responsibility can feel overwhelming at first because it removes the comfort of blaming circumstances. It removes the safety of waiting for the right time. It places the focus back on you. And yet, despite the discomfort, there is also a sense of clarity that comes with it. A feeling that something inside you is aligning for the first time. Even if you cannot fully articulate what that alignment is, you begin to sense that your life is not supposed to be defined by external structures alone, but by an internal standard that you have yet to fully claim. You begin to question the path you are on, not out of dissatisfaction alone, but out of curiosity. You wonder what would happen if you stopped following what was expected and started exploring what felt true, even if that truth is not yet fully formed. And this curiosity opens a space that did not exist before, a space where new possibilities can emerge. At the same time, resistance appears, not from the outside first, but from within. Your mind presents reasons, practical concerns, potential risks. It reminds you of everything you could lose, everything that could go wrong. And this is where many people turn back, not because they lack potential, but because they misinterpret this resistance as a sign to stop, when in reality, it is a natural response to stepping beyond what is familiar. If you observe this resistance closely, you will notice that it is rooted in the same patterns that shaped your previous decisions. The need for certainty, the preference for safety, the avoidance of discomfort. And recognizing this allows you to see it differently, not as an authority, but as a conditioned response, something that can be acknowledged without being obeyed. As this awareness deepens, the concept of living with a mission begins to shift from an abstract idea to a practical consideration. You start to ask different questions. Not what is easiest, not what is safest, but what is aligned, what moves you closer to the version of yourself you are beginning to recognize. And even if the answers are not immediate, the direction starts to take shape. You realize that a mission is not something you wait to discover fully before acting. It is something you move toward, something that becomes clearer through engagement, through decision, through the willingness to step into uncertainty with intention. And this requires a different kind of thinking, one that does not depend on external validation, one that is willing to proceed without complete evidence. This is where a shift in belief becomes essential because without a level of internal conviction, it is difficult to sustain action in the absence of immediate results. You must begin to accept that what you are moving toward is possible, even if you cannot yet prove it. And that acceptance changes how you interpret every step you take. Small actions that once felt insignificant begin to carry meaning because they are no longer isolated. They are connected to a larger direction. Your focus becomes more deliberate, your energy more intentional. And over time, this creates momentum. Not dramatic at first, but consistent. And that consistency begins to reshape not only what you do, but how you see yourself. You start to identify less with the role you were given and more with the direction you are choosing. And this shift in identity influences your decisions in ways that are difficult to reverse. Because once you begin to see yourself as someone with a purpose, your tolerance for actions that do not support that purpose decreases. You become less selective, more aware, more aligned. This does not mean the path becomes easy. Uncertainty remains. Challenges appear. And there are moments where the old patterns attempt to pull you back. But something has changed. The question that once appeared quietly has now taken a central place in your thinking. And it continues to influence you, not through pressure, but through presence. You no longer move through life completely unconsciously. You notice your choices. You observe your patterns. You begin to understand the connection between your internal state and your external results. And this awareness creates a level of responsibility that cannot be ignored. Because now you see that what you experience is not only shaped by what happens to you, but by how you respond to it. And as this understanding settles in, the idea of a mission becomes less about finding a single answer and more about committing to a direction that reflects your highest potential rather than your lowest expectation. And while that commitment may still feel uncertain, it carries a sense of truth that is difficult to deny. You may not have all the details. You may not know exactly where it leads, but you know enough to recognize that continuing as before is no longer sufficient. And that recognition creates a subtle but undeniable shift. One that does not demand immediate transformation, but makes remaining unchanged increasingly uncomfortable. You expect obstacles to come from the outside, from circumstances, from other people, from lack of resources or timing. Yet the force that shapes your life most consistently operates within you quietly, persistently, influencing your decisions long before action ever takes place. And if you do not understand it, you will spend years trying to change your results without ever addressing the source that produces them. This inner force does not appear as a single voice. It comes in layers. Sometimes as fear, sometimes as doubt, sometimes as hesitation disguised as logic. And because it feels like your own thinking, you rarely question it. You assume it is you being careful, you being realistic, you being responsible. But in many cases, it is simply conditioning repeating itself with authority. Fear is often the first layer you notice. Not always intense, not always overwhelming, but present enough to influence your behavior. It shows up when you consider stepping beyond what is familiar. When you think about making a decision that could change your direction, and instead of appearing as a clear warning, it often comes as a subtle discomfort, a tightening of your focus around what could go wrong, a shift in attention toward risk rather than possibility. What makes fear powerful is not its presence, but your response to it. If you treat it as a signal to stop, it becomes a boundary. If you treat it as something to observe without obeying, it becomes information. And this distinction determines whether you remain within your current limits or begin to move beyond them. Doubt follows closely behind, reinforcing what fear suggests. It questions your ability, your timing, your worthiness. It asks whether you are ready, whether you are capable, whether you are the kind of person who can actually achieve what you are considering. And because these questions appear reasonable, they often go unchallenged. They settle into your thinking as quiet assumptions that shape your decisions without ever being examined directly. Over time, doubt does not need to argue with you. It becomes part of your baseline thinking. You begin to filter your ideas before they fully form. You dismiss possibilities early. You adjust your expectations to match what feels achievable based on your current identity. And this process happens so quickly that you rarely notice it. It feels like clarity when in reality it is limitation being applied automatically. Beneath fear and doubt lies a deeper mechanism that gives them consistency. Repetition. The patterns of thought you engage with every day, often without awareness. The phrases you repeat internally. The interpretations you apply to your experiences. The conclusions you draw from both success and failure. And while each individual thought may seem insignificant, their accumulation creates a structure that defines how you perceive yourself and the world around you. Your mind is not selective in the way you might expect. It does not evaluate each thought for accuracy or usefulness before accepting it. It responds to frequency, to intensity, to what is repeated consistently over time. And what is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes accepted, and what is accepted begins to shape your identity. If you repeatedly tell yourself that something is difficult, your mind organizes your perception to confirm that difficulty. If you consistently focus on what could go wrong, your attention sharpens around risk. If you define yourself through past limitations, your future decisions begin to align with that definition. And this is how a life of limitation is constructed, not through a single decision, but through patterns that go unquestioned. The inner enemy does not need to overpower you. It only needs to guide your repetition. Because repetition builds belief, and belief directs action, and action produces results that appear to confirm the original belief, creating a cycle that reinforces itself over time. You may have experienced moments where you felt motivated, where you saw a different possibility, where you considered taking a new direction, and for a brief period, your thinking expanded, your energy increased, your focus sharpened, but without a change in your underlying patterns. That state fades, and you find yourself returning to familiar thoughts, familiar behaviors, familiar outcomes. Not because you lack desire, but because repetition pulled you back to what you had practiced most. This is why effort alone is often not enough. You can push against your patterns temporarily. You can override them for short periods of time. But unless you change what you repeat consistently, the default will always reassert itself, and this can create frustration because it feels like you are trying yet not progressing in a lasting way. Understanding this shifts the focus from isolated actions to sustained influence over your own thinking. It requires you to observe not only what you do, but what you repeatedly tell yourself, what you focus on, what you accept as true without verification. And this level of awareness is not always comfortable because it reveals how much of your experience has been shaped by patterns you did not consciously choose. At the same time, it also reveals something else, that these patterns are not fixed. They are maintained through repetition. And what is maintained can be altered, not instantly, not through a single decision, but through consistent redirection, through the deliberate choice to introduce new thoughts, new interpretations, new expectations, and to repeat them with enough frequency that they begin to feel familiar. This does not eliminate fear or doubt entirely. They may still appear, but their influence changes. They no longer operate as unquestioned authorities. They become signals that can be evaluated, responses that can be redirected. And over time, this changes the balance within your thinking. It shifts what feels natural, what feels possible, what feels aligned with who you are becoming. You begin to notice that your internal dialogue carries a different tone, less reactive, more intentional, less constrained by past patterns, more open to new directions. And this shift, while subtle at first, influences your behavior in ways that accumulate. Your decisions begin to reflect a different standard. Your actions become more consistent with your potential rather than your limitations. The inner enemy does not disappear, but it loses its position as the dominant force. It no longer defines your boundaries. It becomes one of many inputs you can observe, and this change creates space. Space for new patterns to form, space for different outcomes to emerge, space for a version of yourself that is not confined by what was previously repeated. And as this space expands, you begin to experience a different relationship with your own mind, not as something that controls you, but as something you can influence, guide, and direct over time. And that realization alters the way you approach everything that follows because you no longer see your thoughts as fixed. You see them as part of a process that can be shaped through awareness and consistency. And once that understanding settles in, the limits that once felt internal begin to look like patterns that were never meant to remain permanent. Everything you are today is not the result of a single decision, not the product of one defining moment, but the accumulation of what you have consistently accepted as true about yourself. And once you begin to see this clearly, the idea of identity stops feeling fixed and starts revealing itself as something that has been built, reinforced, and maintained through repetition, often without your conscious awareness. You were not born believing you were limited. You were not born thinking small. You were not born doubting your ability to create something meaningful. Those ideas formed over time, shaped by what you heard, what you experienced, what you interpreted, and most importantly, what you repeated internally until it became familiar. And familiarity gave it the appearance of truth. Identity is not defined by what you occasionally think. It is defined by what you repeatedly accept, the statements you allow to pass through your mind without resistance, the labels you assign to yourself, the interpretations you return to when something does not go as expected. And over time, these patterns create a structure that feels stable, even if it is built on assumptions that were never fully examined. If you consistently accept that you are someone who hesitates, your actions will reflect hesitation. If you repeatedly tell yourself that opportunities are limited, your attention will narrow to confirm that belief. If you define yourself through past outcomes, your future will begin to resemble those outcomes, not because it is predetermined, but because your perception has been conditioned to align with what you have already accepted. This is the law operating beneath the surface. Not visible, not announced, but consistent. You become what you agree with. An agreement is rarely a conscious act. It happens through repetition, through exposure, through the absence of questioning. And once an idea is accepted often enough, it no longer feels like an idea. It feels like reality. Consider how easily a single experience can influence your self-perception if it is repeated in your thinking. A failure interpreted once may pass, but a failure interpreted repeatedly begins to define. You start to use it as evidence. You build a narrative around it. You connect it to other moments, and before long it becomes part of how you describe yourself. Not just what happened, but who you are. The same mechanism applies in the opposite direction, but it is used far less often because it requires intention. It requires you to choose what you will accept rather than passively absorbing what appears. And this is where most people lose control of their identity, not because they lack potential, but because they allow repetition to be guided by circumstance instead of decision. You hear opinions. You observe outcomes. You compare yourself to others, and without realizing it, you begin to internalize conclusions that were never meant to define you. You accept limitations that were not originally yours. You adopt expectations that were shaped by environments that may not reflect what is possible for you. And over time, these borrowed beliefs become integrated into your identity as if they had always been there. Once integrated, they influence everything. Your level of effort, your willingness to take risks, your ability to persist when results are not immediate, your interpretation of setbacks. And because these responses feel consistent, they reinforce the belief that they are natural when in fact they are simply practiced. Identity in this sense is not discovered. It is constructed not once, but continuously through what you allow to be repeated. And if you do not actively participate in that construction, it will be shaped for you by whatever influences are most frequent in your environment. This explains why two people with similar abilities can produce entirely different outcomes. Not because one is inherently more capable, but because one has accepted a different identity. One sees themselves as someone who finds solutions, who persists, who expands beyond initial difficulty, while the other sees themselves as someone who encounters obstacles, who retreats, who confirms their own limitations through repeated interpretation. Neither identity was assigned at birth. Both were developed, reinforced, and stabilized through repetition. And this means that neither is permanent. But it also means that change requires more than intention. It requires a shift in what you consistently accept as true. You cannot maintain the same internal dialogue and expect a different identity to emerge. You cannot repeat the same assumptions and produce a different outcome because the law does not respond to what you wish for occasionally. It responds to what you accept consistently. This is where awareness becomes critical, not as a passive observation, but as an active filter. You begin to notice what you are allowing into your thinking, what you are repeating without question, what you are reinforcing through attention. And once you see these patterns clearly, you are no longer bound to them in the same way. You gain the ability to interrupt them, to challenge them, to replace them with alternatives that align more closely with the direction you intend to move. And while this may feel unnatural at first, it is only because you are introducing a pattern that has not yet been repeated enough to feel familiar. At first, the old identity will still appear stronger because it has been practiced longer. It has more evidence attached to it. It feels more grounded. But if you continue to reinforce a new set of beliefs with consistency, with attention, with repetition, the balance begins to shift. Not instantly, but inevitably. What once felt uncertain starts to feel possible. What once felt distant starts to feel accessible, and over time the new identity begins to stabilize not because you forced it, but because you fed it with consistent agreement. This is not about pretending to be something you are not. It is about recognizing that what you currently believe yourself to be was also formed through repetition. And if that process created your current identity, it can be used to create a different one. The key difference is that this time it is intentional. It is directed. It is aligned with a vision rather than shaped by default. And this changes the trajectory of your actions. Because once you begin to see yourself differently, your decisions begin to follow that perception. You act in ways that are consistent with who you believe you are. You take steps that align with that belief. You persist in situations where you previously would have withdrawn. And these actions create new results which then reinforce the identity you are building, creating a new cycle, one that expands rather than limits. Over time, this cycle becomes self-sustaining just as the previous one was. But now it operates in a different direction, supporting growth, supporting possibility, supporting outcomes that once seemed out of reach. And as this continues, the gap between who you were and who you are becoming becomes more visible. You begin to recognize that the identity you once defended was never fixed. It was simply the result of what you accepted without question. And now that you are choosing differently, that identity no longer holds the same authority. It becomes something you can observe rather than something you must remain. And in that shift, the idea of limitation begins to lose its certainty. Not because the external world has changed, but because the internal agreement that once supported it is no longer being repeated. In the same way, and without that repetition, it gradually loses its influence over how you see yourself and what you consider possible. You have been trained to wait for proof before you move, to gather enough certainty, enough validation, enough external agreement before you allow yourself to act. And on the surface that seems intelligent, it seems careful, it seems responsible. But if you observe closely, you will notice that this pattern keeps most people in a permanent state of preparation. Always almost ready, always one step away from action, yet never fully committed to a direction that could change their life. The individuals who reshape industries, who build systems that outlast them, who rise beyond the expectations placed upon them do not operate from that pattern. They do not wait for the world to confirm what they already sense internally. They move before agreement. They act before evidence becomes visible to others. And this difference is not based on arrogance. It is based on a different relationship with belief. At the center of that relationship is something most people misunderstand. Faith, not as blind optimism, not as denial of reality, but as a disciplined decision to accept a possibility before it is fully proven and to act in alignment with that acceptance long enough for it to materialize. And this requires a level of internal stability that is rarely developed in environments that prioritize external validation. When you rely on evidence as your primary guide, you are always responding to what already exists. You are shaping your decisions based on what has been confirmed, measured, or approved by others. And while this can produce predictable outcomes, it rarely produces expansion because you are operating within the boundaries of what has already been done. Faith, in contrast, allows you to move into spaces that are not yet defined. It allows you to act on an internal standard rather than an external consensus. And this is where new outcomes are created, not by repeating what is known, but by committing to what is not yet visible. This is not comfortable because it removes the safety of agreement. It places you in a position where your decisions may not be understood, where your actions may appear premature, where your direction may seem uncertain to those who rely on proof. And this is why many people retreat, not because the path is impossible, but because it lacks immediate validation. If you examine the pattern closely, you will notice that waiting for evidence often becomes a way of avoiding responsibility. Because as long as you are waiting, you are not fully accountable for the outcome. You can always say that the conditions were not right, that more information was needed, that the timing was not ideal, and this creates a sense of safety, but it also creates stagnation. The shift occurs when you recognize that evidence is often the result of sustained action, not the prerequisite for it. The people you observe as successful did not begin with certainty. They began with a decision, a commitment to a direction that made sense to them internally, even when it was not supported externally. And through consistent action, they generated the very proof that others required before they would believe. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means redefining how you interact with it. Instead of allowing current conditions to determine your limits, you use them as a starting point. You acknowledge what is, but you are not confined by it. You operate with the understanding that what exists now is not a complete picture of what is possible. To do this effectively, your belief must be reinforced through repetition. Because without reinforcement, doubt will reassert itself. External opinions will influence you. Temporary setbacks will appear as confirmation that you were mistaken. And without a stable internal reference, it becomes difficult to continue. This is where disciplined thinking becomes essential, not as a one-time effort, but as a continuous practice. You must consistently direct your attention toward the outcome you are building. You must repeat the acceptance that it is possible. You must align your actions with that acceptance even when results are not immediate. And over time, this creates a feedback loop that strengthens your conviction. At first, the progress may be subtle, not easily visible, not easily measured, but it is occurring. Your thinking is becoming more aligned. Your actions more consistent. Your decisions less influenced by external fluctuation. And this stability allows you to continue when others would stop. As you continue, something begins to change, not only in your results, but in how you interpret them. Setbacks no longer appear as evidence of failure. They become part of the process. Feedback that can be adjusted rather than reasons to withdraw. And this shift in interpretation prevents the cycle of doubt from regaining control. You begin to notice that your ability to act is less dependent on how you feel in a given moment. You are no longer waiting for motivation or confidence to appear before you move. You are operating from commitment from a decision that has already been made. And this creates consistency, which in turn produces results that reinforce the belief you started with. Over time, the gap between your internal conviction and external reality begins to close. Not suddenly, but gradually. And as it does, what once required faith becomes visible, not only to you, but to others. And this is often the point where the world begins to agree. Where the same actions that were once questioned are now recognized. Where the same direction that seemed uncertain is now considered clear. But by that stage, your movement is no longer dependent on agreement because you have already established a different standard, one that is not dictated by external validation. And this allows you to continue expanding beyond what has already been achieved rather than settling into what has been confirmed. The people who operate this way are not immune to doubt or uncertainty, but they do not allow those states to determine their actions. They acknowledge them without surrendering to them. They maintain their direction even when the path is not fully visible. And this consistency is what separates temporary effort from sustained creation. If you bring this back to your own life, the question is not whether you can eliminate uncertainty. It is whether you can act in its presence, whether you can hold a direction long enough for it to take form, whether you can commit to a belief without immediate proof, and allow your actions to generate the evidence that is currently missing. This requires a shift from seeking permission to taking ownership, from waiting for clarity to creating it through movement, from depending on external confirmation to developing internal certainty. And while this shift may feel unfamiliar at first, it becomes more natural with practice. As your experience begins to reflect the outcomes of acting from belief rather than hesitation. And as this pattern stabilizes, you begin to operate from a different position entirely. One where your actions are guided less by what others have already proven and more by what you are willing to prove through your own consistency. And that shift, once established, changes the way you approach every opportunity, every decision, and every direction you choose to pursue. At a certain point, whether you acknowledge it or not, your life begins to separate into two distinct directions. Not loudly, not with a clear announcement, but quietly through the accumulation of your daily decisions. And while both paths may appear similar at the beginning, over time, they lead to outcomes so different that they no longer resemble each other in any meaningful way. One path is built on obedience, not in the obvious sense of being controlled, but in the subtle acceptance of what has already been defined. You follow what is expected. You adjust your ambitions to match what feels realistic. You organize your life around stability. And for a while, this creates a sense of order. You know what to do. You know what comes next. And there is comfort in that predictability. But beneath that comfort, something else develops slowly, almost unnoticeably. A narrowing of possibility. a gradual reduction of your expectations, a quiet shift from creating to maintaining. And over time, this path begins to reveal its true nature, not through sudden failure, but through steady limitation. You begin to notice that your effort produces just enough to continue, but rarely enough to expand. Your energy is consumed by sustaining what already exists, leaving little room for building something new. And this creates a cycle where your actions are focused on preservation rather than growth. As years pass, the accumulation of this pattern becomes more visible, not only in your external results, but in your internal state. The sense of urgency that once pushed you forward diminishes, replaced by routine. Your thinking becomes more cautious, more defensive, more aligned with protecting what you have rather than pursuing what you could create. This is what slow decline looks like. Not a dramatic fall, but a gradual settling, a movement towards smaller expectations, smaller risks, smaller outcomes, until eventually you reach a point where change feels increasingly difficult. Not because it is impossible, but because you have spent so long reinforcing the habits that keep you where you are. The other path begins differently, not with certainty, but with a decision. A decision to move towards something that is not yet fully visible. A decision to operate from a sense of mission rather than obligation. And while this path may appear less stable at first, it contains a different kind of structure, one that is built through intention rather than inherited through expectation. On this path, your actions are not primarily directed toward maintaining what already exists. They are directed toward creating something that can expand beyond your immediate effort. You begin to think in terms of systems of leverage, of structures that can produce results even when you are not actively engaged. And this shift changes how you allocate your time, your energy, and your attention. Instead of trading time directly for outcomes, you begin to invest in processes that can multiply your input. You build mechanisms that continue to operate beyond a single moment of effort. And over time, this creates a different pattern, one where your results are not limited by the hours you can work, but are influenced by the structures you have put in place. This approach requires patience because the initial results may not be immediate. The systems you build take time to develop, to refine, to become effective. And during that period, it may appear as though you are progressing more slowly than those who follow the path of immediate return. But the difference becomes clear over time. As your systems begin to function, your results start to accumulate in a way that is not directly tied to your constant input. And this creates space to think, space to expand, space to pursue opportunities that would not have been accessible if all of your time was consumed by maintaining your current position. The individuals who have operated from this mindset have demonstrated this pattern repeatedly. They did not rely solely on effort. They focused on building structures that could scale, that could extend their reach beyond what was physically possible through individual work alone. And this is what allowed them to create outcomes that appear disproportionate when compared to their initial resources. At the same time, this path demands a different level of responsibility because you are no longer following a predefined structure. You are creating one. Your decisions carry more weight. Your direction is less influenced by external guidance, and this can feel uncertain, especially in the early stages when the results are not yet visible. This is where many people hesitate. They see the potential of expansion, but they also feel the pull of stability, the familiarity of the known path, the reassurance of predictable outcomes. And the choice between these two becomes less about ability and more about willingness. Willingness to accept uncertainty in exchange for possibility. Willingness to delay immediate comfort for long-term expansion. If you observe both paths without emotion, you begin to notice that neither is inherently easy. The path of obedience requires continuous effort to maintain. It demands consistency and routine, endurance and repetition, and acceptance of gradual limitation. While the path of mission requires internal discipline, sustained belief, and the capacity to move forward without immediate confirmation, the difference lies in the direction of the outcome. One path leads toward contraction, the other toward expansion. One organizes your life around what is already defined. The other allows you to define what your life can become. And over time, this distinction becomes more pronounced until the results of each path are no longer comparable. At a certain stage, the consequences of each direction become difficult to ignore, not because they are hidden, but because they are cumulative. They build over years of decisions, years of repetition, years of alignment with either preservation or creation. And by the time they are fully visible, they reflect not a single choice, but a pattern that has been consistently reinforced. You may not feel the full impact of this immediately because both paths can appear stable in the short term. Both can provide a sense of progress. Both can justify themselves through logic. But as time extends, the underlying structure of each path determines the outcome. and that outcome is shaped by what you have been consistently prioritizing. This is where the importance of awareness becomes evident, because without it, you may continue on a path that feels acceptable without recognizing where it ultimately leads. You may focus on short-term comfort without considering long-term consequence. And in doing so, you allow time to reinforce a direction that becomes increasingly difficult to change. But once you see the distinction clearly, once you recognize that your life is being shaped by the path you are consistently choosing, even in small decisions, it becomes difficult to ignore. Not because you are forced to act immediately, but because the awareness itself changes how you interpret your current position. It introduces a level of responsibility that was not present before. And in that awareness, the idea of choice becomes more defined, not as a single moment, but as an ongoing process, one that is reflected in how you think, how you act, how you allocate your time, and how you respond to opportunities and challenges. And as that process continues, the direction you are moving in becomes less abstract and more concrete, shaped not by intention alone, but by the consistency of what you are willing to do. Most people believe that success is a matter of effort, that if they work hard enough, long enough, consistently enough, the results will eventually follow. And this belief feels logical because effort is visible, measurable, and socially rewarded. But if effort alone were the determining factor, then the people who work the hardest would consistently rise to the highest levels of wealth and freedom. And that is not what you observe when you look closely at how outcomes are actually distributed. What separates those who accumulate wealth from those who continuously exchange time for survival is not the willingness to work. It is the structure through which their work is applied. One group operates within systems. The other operates within cycles. And while both may appear productive on the surface, their long-term trajectories are fundamentally different. When you operate within a cycle, your input is directly tied to your output. You work, you produce, you receive, and then you repeat. And while this can provide stability, it also creates a ceiling because your results are limited by the amount of time and energy you can consistently provide. And no matter how disciplined you are, those resources are finite. This is the model most people are guided into. Not because it is the most effective, but because it is the most predictable. It allows for clear expectations. It fits within established structures, and it reinforces the idea that effort is the primary driver of progress. But over time, the limitations of this model become evident. Not immediately, but gradually as the demands on your time increase while your ability to expand remains constrained. In contrast, a system is designed to produce outcomes beyond your immediate effort. It is a structure that continues to function even when you are not actively engaged in every step of the process. And this changes the relationship between time and results. Because instead of requiring constant input, the system begins to generate output through its design. Building a system requires a different kind of thinking. One that prioritizes leverage over labor, structure over repetition, and long-term function over immediate return. And this is where many people hesitate because the initial stages of creating a system often do not produce visible results. It requires investment of time and energy without immediate compensation and without a shift in perspective. This can feel inefficient. However, what appears inefficient in the short term often becomes exponentially effective in the long term. Because once the system is established and refined, it begins to operate with increasing consistency, producing results that are not directly tied to each individual unit of effort you provide. And this creates a compounding effect that is not possible within a purely linear model. Consider how this applies in practice. Instead of working continuously to generate a single outcome, you create a process that can generate that outcome repeatedly. Instead of solving the same problem over and over, you develop a structure that solves it consistently. And as this structure improves, its output increases without requiring proportional increases in your input. This is not limited to any specific industry or method. It is a principle that can be applied across different contexts. The key is recognizing that your time is not the only variable that determines your results. The way your actions are organized, the systems you build, the processes you refine all contribute to how effectively your effort is translated into outcome. Those who understand this do not abandon effort. They redirect it. They focus their energy on creating structures that can extend their reach, that can multiply their impact, that can continue to operate even when they are not directly involved in every detail. And this is what allows them to move beyond the limitations of a time-based model. At the same time, this approach requires patience and discipline because the early stages can feel uncertain. You may invest significant effort without immediate visible return. You may need to refine your approach multiple times before the system begins to function effectively. And during this period, it can be tempting to revert to familiar patterns that provide quicker feedback. This is where your internal standard becomes critical. Because without a clear understanding of what you are building and why, it is easy to misinterpret the absence of immediate results as a lack of progress, when in reality, you are laying the foundation for outcomes that will emerge later. And maintaining that perspective requires consistency in both thinking and action. As your systems begin to take shape, the nature of your work changes. You spend less time repeating tasks and more time improving the structures that produce those tasks. You move from being the primary source of output to being the designer of processes that generate output. And this shift increases your capacity, not by increasing your effort, but by increasing the effectiveness of how your effort is applied over time. This creates a divergence between those who continue to operate within cycles and those who build systems. One group remains dependent on constant input, their progress tied to how much they can sustain, while the other begins to experience results that extend beyond their immediate activity, creating opportunities for further expansion. This divergence is not always visible in the early stages. Both groups may appear to be working equally hard. Both may experience periods of growth. But as time extends, the underlying structure of their approach determines the outcome and the difference becomes more pronounced. Those who rely solely on effort often reach a point where maintaining their current level requires as much energy as they can provide, leaving little room for additional growth. While those who have built systems find that their existing structures begin to generate results that can be reinvested, refined, and expanded. This creates a compounding effect where each improvement builds on the previous one, where each system supports the development of the next. And over time, this leads to outcomes that appear disproportionate when compared to the initial input. Not because of luck, but because of the way the effort was structured from the beginning. Understanding this does not immediately change your situation, but it changes how you evaluate your actions. It shifts your focus from how much you are doing to how effectively what you are doing is organized. And this awareness influences your decisions, your priorities, and your long-term direction. You begin to question whether your current efforts are creating something that can expand beyond you, or whether they are simply maintaining a cycle that requires constant repetition. And this question, once considered seriously, begins to alter how you approach your work, not by reducing effort, but by directing it toward building structures that can sustain and multiply your results over time. And as this perspective settles in, the idea of success becomes less about how much you can endure and more about what you can create that continues to function beyond your immediate presence. Shifting your focus from survival to construction in a way that gradually redefines what your time, your energy, and your potential are capable of producing. Change does not happen in a single moment of decision. It is built in the quiet repetition of what you do each day, in the patterns you reinforce when no one is watching, in the standards you hold when there is no immediate reward. And if your identity has been shaped through repetition, then it must be rebuilt the same way, deliberately, consistently, through a structure that aligns your mind, your body, your direction, and your ability to remain still enough to hear what most people ignore. You cannot rely on motivation to sustain this process because motivation fluctuates. It responds to emotion, to environment, to temporary states that are not stable enough to support long-term change. What you need instead is a ritual, a sequence of actions repeated daily that does not depend on how you feel in a given moment, but on a decision that has already been made. The first element of this ritual is your mind. Not in the abstract sense, but in the specific patterns you choose to repeat. What you expose yourself to, what you focus on, what you allow to become familiar, because your thinking is not random. It is influenced by what you consistently engage with. And if you do not direct it, it will default to whatever is most accessible, which is often shaped by your previous environment. You begin by interrupting that default by choosing what you will feed your mind before anything else enters. Not after the day has already begun, but at the start when your attention is most open, and in that space you introduce ideas that align with the direction you intend to move. Not occasionally, but consistently until they begin to feel natural. This may involve repeating statements that define who you are becoming, not as empty phrases, but as instructions to your own perception. You are not describing your current state. You are establishing a reference point. And through repetition, that reference point begins to influence how you interpret your actions, your challenges, your progress. The second element is your body. Because your physical state directly affects your mental clarity, your energy, your ability to sustain focus. And yet it is often treated as separate from your development, when in reality, it is foundational. You cannot expect consistent performance from an inconsistent physical state. And so your ritual must include movement not as an obligation, but as a way of aligning your physiology with the level of performance you expect from yourself. This does not require complexity. It requires consistency. a commitment to maintain your body in a state that supports your intention. And over time, this becomes less about discipline and more about identity. You are not forcing yourself to act. You are maintaining a standard that reflects who you are becoming. The third element is your mission, the direction that organizes your actions. Because without a clear point of focus, your energy disperses. You move, but without alignment. And this creates activity without progress. And so each day you must reconnect with what you are building, not in vague terms, but in specific actionable steps that move you forward. Even if those steps are small, you define what matters most for that day. Not everything that could be done, but what must be done. What aligns directly with your long-term direction. And you commit to completing it regardless of how you feel. Because this consistency builds momentum. And momentum reduces resistance, making it easier to continue. The fourth element is stillness, which is often overlooked because it does not appear productive. Yet, it is essential because without moments of quiet, your thinking becomes reactive, shaped by external input rather than internal clarity. And over time, this leads to decisions that are influenced more by noise than by intention. Stillness allows you to observe your own patterns, to notice where you are aligned and where you are not, to recognize the thoughts that are guiding your actions, and to adjust them before they become automatic. It creates a space where you are not responding, but choosing. And this distinction becomes more valuable as your responsibilities increase. In this space, you are able to reconnect with the direction you have chosen, to reaffirm it, to refine it, and to ensure that your daily actions remain aligned with it rather than drifting into patterns that do not support your growth. And while this may only require a short period each day, its impact extends far beyond that moment. When these four elements are practiced together, not occasionally, but consistently, they begin to reinforce each other. Your mind becomes clearer, your body more capable, your actions more aligned, your awareness more precise, and this creates a foundation that supports sustained change. Not through intensity, but through stability. At first, the results may not be dramatic. The change is subtle, difficult to measure, but they are occurring. Your internal state is becoming more organized, your responses more intentional, your decisions more consistent. And over time, this internal shift begins to reflect externally in the way you act, in the opportunities you recognize, in the outcomes you produce. The key is not to look for immediate transformation, but to maintain the process long enough for it to take effect. Because the same principle that created your previous patterns now works in your favor. Repetition builds familiarity. Familiarity builds acceptance. Acceptance builds identity. And identity influences action. As this continues, the gap between what you intend and what you do begins to close. You no longer rely on temporary motivation to initiate action. Your ritual carries you forward. It provides structure when your emotions fluctuate. It maintains direction when distractions appear. And this consistency becomes a defining characteristic of how you operate. Over time, what once required effort becomes automatic. Not because it is easy, but because it has been practiced enough to become part of who you are. And this is where transformation stabilizes. Not as a temporary change, but as a new baseline, a new way of thinking, acting, and responding that reflects the identity you have been building. This does not eliminate challenges. It changes how you engage with them. You approach them with a level of clarity and control that was not present before. You are less reactive, more deliberate, less influenced by external fluctuation, more grounded in your own direction. And this allows you to continue progressing even when conditions are not ideal. And as this pattern becomes more established, the idea of change no longer feels distant or uncertain. It becomes something you are actively shaping each day, not through occasional bursts of effort, but through a structure that aligns your mind, your body, your mission, and your awareness in a way that steadily redeefs what you are capable of sustaining. At some point, the process stops being about improvement and becomes about decision. Not a partial adjustment, not a gradual negotiation with your old habits, but a clear separation between what you were and what you are choosing to become. And this moment does not arrive with perfect conditions. It does not wait for certainty. It appears when your awareness has reached a level where continuing as before no longer feels acceptable. You can carry the old blueprint for years, refining it, optimizing it, making small changes that give the appearance of progress. But if the foundation remains the same, the outcome will continue to follow the same pattern. And this is why many people feel as though they are moving without truly advancing, because they are improving a structure that was never designed to take them where they want to go. Burning the old blueprint is not a symbolic act. It is a practical shift in how you define yourself, how you make decisions, how you allocate your time. It is the point where you stop referring to who you were as a reference for what you will do next, and instead begin to operate from a standard that reflects who you have decided to become. This requires clarity, not in every detail of your future, but in your direction, in the identity you are committing to. Because without that clarity, your actions will continue to be influenced by past patterns. You will hesitate in moments that require commitment. You will adjust your behavior to match familiar expectations, and the cycle will continue under a different name. Decision in this sense is not simply choosing between options. It is removing alternatives. It is narrowing your focus to a path that you are willing to pursue regardless of temporary discomfort, regardless of external opinion, regardless of how long it takes to see results. And this level of commitment changes how you respond to everything that follows. When you decide fully, your actions become more direct. You spend less time evaluating whether you should move and more time executing the direction you have already chosen. Your energy is no longer divided between multiple possibilities. It is concentrated, and this concentration increases the effectiveness of what you do. At the same time, this decision exposes areas where your current behavior is not aligned with your chosen identity. Patterns that once felt normal begin to stand out. Habits that once seemed acceptable begin to feel inconsistent, and this creates a tension that pushes you to adjust. Not because you are forcing change, but because you are no longer willing to maintain what contradicts your direction. Walking as one scent is not about external recognition. It is not about proving anything to others. It is about operating with a level of internal certainty that guides your actions without constant doubt. It is the understanding that your direction has been chosen and that your role is to move in alignment with it consistently, without needing continuous validation. This changes your relationship with uncertainty. You no longer interpret it as a signal to stop, but as a natural part of moving beyond what is already known. You accept that not every step will be clear in advance, but you trust that clarity will emerge through movement. And this trust allows you to continue when others would pause. It also changes how you interpret resistance, both internal and external. Challenges are no longer seen as signs that you are on the wrong path, but as part of the process of building something that requires effort, adjustment, and persistence. And this perspective prevents you from abandoning your direction at the first sign of difficulty. As you continue to operate from this decision, your actions begin to accumulate in a way that reflects your commitment. Not in isolated moments, but in patterns. Your consistency increases. Your focus sharpens. Your ability to follow through strengthens. And over time, this creates results that align with the identity you have chosen. This does not happen instantly. The transition from your previous patterns to your new standard requires repetition, reinforcement, and attention. There will be moments where the old blueprint attempts to reassert itself, where familiar thoughts and behaviors appear. But the difference now is that you recognize them, and recognition reduces their influence. Instead of returning to them automatically, you pause. You adjust. You choose differently. And each time you do this, you weaken the connection to the old pattern and strengthen the new one. And over time, the shift becomes more stable, less dependent on conscious effort, more integrated into how you operate. Your environment may not change immediately. The people around you may still operate from the same patterns. The structures you interact with may still reflect the same limitations, but your response to them is different. You are no longer shaped by them in the same way. You interact with them without being defined by them. And this creates a level of independence that was not present before. You begin to notice that your decisions are guided less by what is expected and more by what is aligned. You evaluate opportunities based on whether they support your direction rather than whether they fit a familiar pattern. And this leads you into situations that reflect your new standard, even if they require you to step outside of what you have previously experienced. Over time, this shift in behavior produces a shift in results. Not always immediately visible, but consistent. Your actions begin to generate outcomes that reflect your commitment rather than your hesitation. And as these outcomes accumulate, they reinforce the identity you have chosen, creating a cycle that supports your continued movement forward. The idea of fate in this context is no longer something external. It is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in shaping through the decisions you make, the standards you maintain, the actions you repeat, and this realization changes how you approach your life because it places responsibility and possibility in the same space. You are no longer waiting for a moment to define you. You are defining each moment through how you respond to it. And this creates a sense of direction that is not dependent on external conditions. It is sustained through your own consistency, your own commitment, your own willingness to continue. And as this becomes more established, the separation between who you were and who you are becoming becomes clearer, not as a distant idea, but as a present reality reflected in your actions. You're thinking your results, and this clarity reinforces your decision, making it less something you must remember and more something you naturally express. At that point, The question is no longer whether you can change. It becomes whether you will continue, whether you will maintain the standard you have set, whether you will keep moving in alignment with the direction you have chosen. And in that ongoing choice, your path continues to take shape, defined not by what was given to you, but by what you are willing to build from this moment forward.